Hey everybody, the 5th episode of The Chosen Season 3 premiered this past Sunday, and now it's time for us to break it down and see exactly what happened. Before we do so, be sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you know when videos like this are coming your way. Without further ado, let's get to the episode. The episode opens with a flashback to 2 weeks prior to the events of the last episode, where we see two women rushing through the muddy streets of Capernaum, frantic and breathing heavily. They wake the local doctor from his sleep and he welcomes them into his home, where he tries his best to help one of the women deliver a baby, but there's too much blood. The woman, who's revealed to be Eden, loses her baby, and her mother weep together as the opening credits roll. Back in the present day, the same doctor finds himself treating another dying child. He announces that he can't do anything more and suggests that Jairus begin making accommodations for her death. But Jairus tells him not to make any accommodations until she is dead, saying that he will be back soon. Simon and Eden share an awkward morning together, Simon packing up his lunch as Eden chops up their food. She isn't talking to him, so before he leaves, he vainly tries to employ Gaius' advice from the previous episode. Whatever it is, you're right, I'm sorry. Frustrated by him not knowing what he's apologizing for, Eden just shakes her head at him and he departs. Big James walks in to greet his family, and he and John immediately start arguing. When Zebedee enters, they talk about Thomas and Rama for a bit, before Zebedee announces that he has sold their boat in order to purchase an olive grove. For a long time, their family business has been fishing, but now that the Messiah has come and called his sons his disciples, he wants to try something out for himself. In the outskirts of Capernaum, Nathanael and Thad, carrying buckets of water, talk about how much the apostles' former lives affect their new ones. Eventually, they come across blood on the ground, and following its tracks, they come across Veronica, who's pitched her tent by the cliffs. She rejects their offer to get a doctor, and when they offer to introduce her to their rabbi, a different kind of doctor, she initially rejects that offer too. But when she recognizes that the rabbi they're talking about is the one who healed the paralytic at the pool of Bethesda back in Jerusalem, she changes her tune entirely. She says if she could but touch his garment, she'd be healed. Nathanael decries this as superstition, but once she makes her case, they invite her to accompany them. Mary Magdalene, Tamar, Judas, and Zebedee walk through a grove of olive trees, which Tamar points out are pitiful and dying. When they ask the owner's son why he didn't tend to them, he explains that he was away and got married. Judas barters with the man, working out a deal where he will help teach Zebedee how to manage the trees. Back in Capernaum, Simon and Gaius are working on the cistern together. After putting a piece in its rightful place, they excitedly clap hands with one another. Simon's response to touching hands with a Gentile leads to some friendly banter between them. Simon eventually tells Gaius that his advice didn't work, and Gaius points out that apologizing doesn't matter if you don't know what you're apologizing for. When Simon asks Gaius if he has any kids, Gaius explains that he has two, one which is his own, and a servant boy whose mother died giving birth and who he has raised as his own. When Simon continues teasing him by telling him he deserves a medal for his kindness, Gaius throws dirt on him and tells him not to make light of his situation. He says he doesn't want a medal, but he stops just short of expressing what it is that he does want. Jairus explains to Yusuf what's happened to Neely, and he asks Yusuf to take him to Jesus. Yusuf says he doesn't know where Jesus is, but he offers to take him to his men, taking him to Andrew's house. Judas is the one who opens the door, and while he originally tries to turn them away, upon hearing Jairus' situation, he points them in the direction of Simon's house. Simon Z barges in on Mary Magdalene and Tamar to announce Jesus is back. Jesus is in Simon's house eating breakfast with some of his disciples, and when he compliments Eden on her food, he notices that something is off about her reaction. Philip asks Jesus about fasting, pointing out that Jesus doesn't ask his disciples to fast as John the Baptist or the Pharisees do. Jesus employs wedding imagery to convey the fact that while he is with them, they don't need to fast, but that they will fast once he's gone. He has little James grab an old wineskin in order to convey the fact that one shouldn't put new wine into old wineskins. But when the disciples are confused by this, he explains that the ways of his kingdom won't fit into old containers or frameworks. The disciples are left confused by the news that Jesus is going to be gone sometime soon, but Jesus doesn't elaborate any further than that. Shortly after Z, Mary, and Tamar arrive, Yusuf and Jairus also barge into the room. Jairus falls to his knees and proclaims that he knows Jesus. He says he's read accounts from someone he trusts and knows Jesus is a healer, and he asks him to heal his daughter. Jesus is amazed by his faith and agrees to follow him. Back at the cistern, Simon and Gaius discuss religion, parties, and prophecies. When Simon recites Jeremiah's oracle regarding the cistern without water, Gaius asks if they've forsaken their god of water. Simon explains that they only have one god, which Gaius calls efficient but boring. Gaius begins to explain the pantheon to Peter, who calls it exhausting. Gaius explains the sacrifices one would make to the different gods depending on what they wanted from the gods, but their conversation is interrupted by a gathering crowd. Barnaby rushes by and explains that Jesus is going to do a miracle, and that Simon should probably be there. So Simon rushes to join in. A bustling and uncontrolled crowd has swarmed around the overwhelmed Jesus, pushing him through the streets of Capernaum and knocking his disciples this way and that and even to the ground. Z sees a zealot watching him, and as Veronica calls for Jesus, she feels her flow of blood kicking in. She has little time to act. Simon, James, and John arrive on the scene while Gaius calms the Roman soldiers and motions for them to leave Jesus be. Veronica encounters the pilgrim who called her unclean in the last episode, who calls over Yusuf and pronounces her uncleanness to him as well. In a final act of desperation, Veronica darts into the crowd, and as she trips, her hands grace Jesus' tzitzit, the tassels hanging from his cloak. A panic-stricken Jesus comes to a sudden halt and holds on to his apostles for stability, suggesting that someone touched him. Simon explains that everyone's been pressing against him, but Jesus says that he expressly felt power go out of him. Veronica reluctantly announces that it was her and explains her reasoning behind trying to touch him, telling him that she learned of his abilities from the man at the pool. Jesus kneels before her and calls her his daughter, explaining that it was her faith, not his clothing, that healed her. When Yusuf raises the matter of her bleeding, Jesus authoritatively pronounces her clean, silencing Yusuf. He says that she has blessed him and that he knows she is exhausted, and while he wishes he could stay longer, he has other matters he needs to attend to. There's another who has faith like hers. He dismisses the crowd, telling them that he will interact with them later, but that he has some pressing matters to address. He sends Z away to escort the pilgrims back to their tents, telling him to be kind to them, appoints Nathanael, Thad, and Philip to make sure no one bothers the crowd, and invites Simon, James, and John to follow him. When Mary asks Veronica if she needs anything, she requests a knife, which Philip provides. As Jesus and Jairus approach his house, they hear flutes in the distance, the sound of mourning. A Pharisee explains that Neely has passed away, but Jesus tells Jairus not to be afraid, but to believe. He says that she will be well. Jesus commands the mourners and flute players to stop, but when they don't listen, he stops them himself. When they explain that they were mourning for the girl, he tells them to go away because she's just sleeping, which causes them to laugh. The Pharisee asks Jesus if he's a necromancer, but Jesus just commands everybody to leave, a command which Jairus reiterates. Jesus tells the boys to take everyone outside, and after they've done so, they follow him up to Neely's room. Michal rebukes Jairus for being absent when their daughter died, but Jairus begs her to trust Jesus. Jesus kneels down and uncovers the girl, then takes her hand and whispers into her ear, "Little lamb, arise." Neely wakes up as if from a nap, and everyone is in total shock. Jesus commands all in the room to remain totally silent about what they've just witnessed, as it isn't yet time for the commotion that would result from such an event, either for Jesus or for the family. He suggests that they get Neely some food, and Jairus thanks him. Jesus thanks him for his faith. Out in the alleyway, Veronica uses Philip's knife to cut away her bloody garments, tossing them into the furnace before making her way out to the Sea of Galilee, where she cleanses herself in the lake. Back outside Jairus' house, the Pharisee confronts Jesus, asking him if he touched a corpse or a woman who was bleeding. He pronounces Jesus ceremonially unclean until sundown and commands him to undertake the rites of purification. When Jesus looks to Yusuf, he shakes his head and looks away in shame, unwilling to identify himself with Jesus. The other Pharisee threatens to write a letter to the Sanhedrin if Jesus fails to comply to his commands. Jesus, annoyed, asks who else touched either him or the bleeding woman, and James, John, and Simon raise their hands. He tells them to come with him and to get the others. When Jesus and the rest of the group arrive at the sea, Veronica is afraid that she made Jesus unclean and asks if the priest sent him, but Jesus says that the man only thinks he did. Really, they just wanted to go for a swim. After a brief interaction with Veronica, Jesus rushes into the water to play a game of chicken, splash around, and goof around with his apostles. From the shore, Eden stands alone, lost in her own thoughts, likely feeling unseen as everyone enjoys life while she is stuck in her own heartache. I enjoy this episode quite a bit. I always like episodes that directly adapt stories from scripture because I love seeing how filmmakers visualize it and bring it to life. And we got a lot of really good scriptural moments in this particular episode. Beyond that, I think this episode was a much stronger one than the last, though really the two episodes together feel like one long movie, and in many ways, I think, work better when viewed in that light, which makes sense given that they're titled Clean Part 1 and Clean Part 2. I like how this episode was bookended with Eden's struggle, shedding further light on what she's going through and giving us insight to her struggle, so that the flashback at the beginning of the episode is probably exactly what we can imagine was playing in her mind as she watched everyone goofing off at the end. Her and Simon's conflict continues to be a point of frustration for me, not necessarily frustration directed at any one person, but frustration at the entire situation itself, mainly because it breaks my heart how horrific events such as miscarriages are often left unmentioned or treated as taboo subjects in many circles, even Christian circles. I'm really glad that the writers are using this storyline to hopefully shed light on the issue, though at the same time I do feel really bad for Simon, who's been making every effort after effort trying to figure out what he did or didn't do, and is trying what he can to help mend the rift between him and Eden, but is constantly getting shut down over something he has no way of knowing. On that note, I also like the parallels the show drew between Eden's miscarriage and the death of Jairus' daughter, and I think that the miracles we saw in this episode are going to really influence a lot of things going forward. I'm especially interested to see how Gaius responds to all of that, given that there seems to be something going on with his adopted servant son, which seems to be setting up another miracle lifted straight from scripture, which we're going to probably be talking about within the next few episodes. All really exciting stuff. That being said, I'm still having a bit difficulty with some of the timeline chronology stuff that I mentioned in the last episode, because there were some scenes in this episode that felt like they were meant to be in the last episode, and vice versa. The scene with Z barging in on Mary and Tamar to announce the return of Jesus, in particular from this episode, seemed like it belonged in the last episode, especially since we see all of them with Jesus in that episode, and it left me kind of confused as to what exactly Jesus was supposed to be returning from in the context of this particular episode. Stuff like that's really not a big deal in any way whatsoever, but other people have mentioned confusion over the same thing, so I figured I'd draw attention to it. Other than that very, very minor thing, another really good episode. Be sure to let me know what you thought about it in the comments down below, and if you haven't done so already, be sure to leave a like on this video so YouTube knows that videos like this are worth watching. Also, be sure to subscribe to this channel and turn on the notification bell so you know when other videos like this are coming your way. Until next time, I'm David Tate, and this is Now Let's Be Honest. Be sure to keep a smile on your face and don't let anybody steal your joy. Peace out.
You read a verse, you sing a hymn, the money's in the plate. Sundays you mark out for him, but even then you show up late. You bought the shirt, you wear the cross, but sin throughout the week. For 30 shekels and a noose, you kiss him on the cheek.